My name is David Davis, and the sound that shattered my morning coffee ritual was the declaration of war on my family's 134-year-old heritage. What I witnessed through my binoculars, a line of hard-hatted trespassers cutting into the sacred ground my great-grandfather died defending, had ignited a conflict so brutal it would conclude with a corrupt HOA president incarcerated, a billion-dollar developer ruined, and an entire luxury condominium complex powerless in 110-degree heat as I controlled the switch dictating their fate. They assumed they could exploit a humble rancher. They had no idea they had just provoked the man who would ultimately control their destiny. The Davies Ranch had been owned by my family for 4 generations. Each morning, stepping onto that porch, I could feel the weight of those many years, all those narratives ingrained in the red soil and native grasses. My grandfather often recounted the drought of '56, when he sold everything but the land to keep it within the family. I would sit on his knee as a boy, listening to tales of how he and my grandmother subsisted on beans and cornbread for months, observing their neighbors lose their properties to the bank while he persevered through sheer stubbornness. My father continued that legacy, working tirelessly to rebuild the herd after inheriting land rich in history but poor in livestock. He never took a vacation, never complained, never even considered selling, even when cattle prices plummeted in the '80s. I recall him telling me, his calloused hands gripping my shoulders, that this land wasn't truly ours to possess. We were merely its stewards for the next generation. Every fence we repaired, every water tank we installed, every decision we made had to honor both those who preceded us and those who would follow. Now someone was dissecting it as if it belonged to them, treating 4 generations of diligent stewardship as meaningless dirt obstructing their plans. I mounted my ATV and sped across the pasture towards the commotion, dust billowing behind me. The morning sun was already oppressive, foreshadowing another day above 100 degrees Fahrenheit, and sweat stung my eyes as I rode. The closer I got, the more my anger intensified. These were not county road crews or utility workers performing legitimate repairs. These were private contractors laying thick black cables and erecting colossal power transmission poles, creating a deliberate blemish across prime grazing land essential for my cattle's summer sustenance. A perspiring foreman in a hard hat looked up as I skidded to a halt, dirt and grass spraying from my tires. When I demanded to know their purpose on my property, he appeared barely concerned, wiping his face with a grimy handkerchief as if I were just another minor annoyance in his day. He informed me they were simply following directives, supplying power for the new section of Sterling Creek Estates, the luxurious development that had been gradually encroaching upon our ranch boundaries over the past few years like a creeping ailment. He asserted they had an easement, patting a binder under his arm as if that settled the matter, as if my family's 130-year history on this land held no significance compared to whatever documentation he possessed. Sterling Creek Estates had commenced modestly, just a few dozen residences on what was formerly the old Morrison place after Alice Morrison passed away and her urban-dwelling children sold to developers. Initially, it appeared innocuous affluent individuals from Dallas and Houston constructing weekend getaways, maintaining their estates meticulously and largely keeping to themselves. However, each subsequent stage grew larger, more aggressive, and increasingly disrespectful of the long-established rural community. When I informed him there was no authorized access and demanded to see the documentation, he reluctantly produced what resembled a child's crude drawing. The diagram depicted a Powerline path clearly traversing my pasture, yet the space for a landowner's signature was conspicuously blank. There was no recorded easement number, no county seal, no notary stamp, nothing official. It was entirely fabricated, a mere wishful forgery at best. I instructed him to cease operations immediately and vacate my land, my voice escalating with each word, but he merely shrugged and turned back to his crew as if I were an annoying dog he could disregard. He advised me to address the issue with Brenda Carril at the HOA office if I had a problem, uttering her name with a deference that clearly indicated who truly controlled the operation. That name sent shivers down my spine. I had heard rumors about the new HOA president from my neighbors. Individuals like Jim and Sarah Henderson, who had been ranching the adjacent property for 3 decades, raising 3 children and building a modest but prosperous cattle business, through honest work and diligent management. There was old Pete Martinez, whose family had worked their small property since before Texas became a state, preserving a generational understanding of weather patterns and grass management that no academic text could impart. These were decent, honest people who toiled with their hands and respected the land, yet they lived in growing apprehension of what Sterling Creek's expansion might signify for their way of life. Rumor had it that Brenda Carril was an outsider from the eastern states, perhaps New York or Boston, who had accumulated wealth through real estate speculation and viewed our rural community solely as impediments to her grand vision of a suburban utopia. She had moved into one of the largest residences in Phase 2 and immediately began speaking of upgrading the neighborhood and introducing modern standards to an undeveloped area. The disdain in her voice when she spoke of local ranchers was thinly veiled, as if we were some historical curiosity that needed to be swept aside for progress. Contacting her proved almost impossible, a deliberate bureaucratic labyrinth designed to vex and exhaust anyone attempting to reach the actual decision-maker. I spent 2 full days battling gatekeepers and voicemail systems, being transferred from one office to another, enduring hold music that grated on my nerves, and receiving promises of callbacks that never materialized. When I finally reached her by phone, her voice became cold and condescending the moment she realized my identity. She uttered my surname as if it were something repulsive she had encountered, then proceeded to completely disregard my concerns with the kind of practiced arrogance that stems from years of domineering over those she deemed beneath her. She asserted that their developer had assured the board all necessary permissions were secured, implying with barely concealed scorn that I must have forgotten signing something, or that perhaps a previous owner had done so. The insinuation that my family or I were either incompetent or forgetful infuriated me, especially since there had been no previous owner in recent memory who could have signed such a document. When I firmly stated that no such access existed and demanded the immediate removal of their equipment, she actually chuckled, a brief, unpleasant sound that grated on my nerves like nails on a blackboard. She informed me that their third phase required power, that their residents were highly influential individuals anticipating imminent occupancy, and that this power line constituted vital infrastructure with project deadlines mandated by investors, who would not tolerate delays from local provincials who failed to grasp the workings of the contemporary world. She implied I simply lacked comprehension of the intricacies of modern development, speaking to me as if I were some unsophisticated country bumpkin obstructing inevitable advancement, as if the land my family had meticulously cared for over a century was merely vacant space awaiting her vision to imbue it with significance. When I cautioned her about legal proceedings, she dismissed that too, with a laugh akin to shattering glass, informing me that their legal department routinely handled such minor disputes and possessed the resources to pursue it to whatever outcome served their interests. Sterling Homes Development, she stated, had encountered tenacious resistors previously, and they had never been defeated. Then she abruptly terminated the call, leaving only a humming silence and my escalating fury. They had issued a challenge with that phone call. They believed their wealth, their influential connections, and their sophisticated attorneys rendered them invulnerable. They thought they could overpower a simple rancher who would be clueless on how to retaliate against their elaborate operation. They had no inkling of what they had just unleashed. Over the ensuing weeks, as my attorney Ben Carter drafted cease and desist notifications, the situation progressively worsened. Not only did the contractors persist in their work with renewed urgency, but Brenda initiated a systematic campaign to sway public opinion against me throughout the Sterling Creek community and beyond. She commenced attending county commissioner meetings, disseminating rumors that I was an unreasonable holdout attempting to extort funds from diligent families who merely desired dependable electricity for their residences. She depicted herself as a sensible community leader endeavoring to provide essential amenities while contending with a rapacious rancher who perceived monetary gain in the misfortunes of others. She asserted I was impeding crucial infrastructure out of pure avarice, that I had demanded exorbitant compensation for an easement that any rational individual would concede as a neighborly courtesy. Every assertion was false, yet she narrated her stories with such conviction and apparent sincerity that individuals who had never met me began to accept them as truth. Local social media platforms began to fill with posts concerning the eccentric rancher, causing disruptions for their new community. People who had never set foot on my property were labeling me selfish and antiquated, posting irate comments about how rural landowners needed to acknowledge that times were evolving and they could not indefinitely impede progress. Brenda even organized a petition demanding the county compel me to permit the power line, claiming I was jeopardizing their children by obstructing electricity to their homes and endangering families during the scorching Texas summer. The truth was precisely the inverse of her propaganda. The power line wasn't merely encroaching, it was actively decimating my livelihood and jeopardizing my capacity to sustain the ranch that employed several local families and contributed to the rural economy she appeared so eager to abolish. The path they had selected severed my primary grazing rotation, a meticulously planned system my father had cultivated over decades to uphold pasture health and soil stability. Their arbitrary straight line disrupted everything, compelling me to relocate cattle prematurely, overgraze certain zones while leaving others untouched, and completely restructure an operation that had taken generations to perfect. Feed expenditures escalated as I was compelled to procure hay and supplements to compensate for the grazing land to which I had lost access. My earnings plummeted as cattle failed to achieve their customary weights on schedule, disrupting agreements with buyers who relied on dependable delivery dates. I was hemorrhaging money combating their illicit activity, while they portrayed me as the avaricious antagonist in their meticulously constructed narrative. Meanwhile, my rural neighbors observed apprehensively from the sidelines, hesitant to speak out but quietly endorsing my struggle because they knew they could be next. The Hendersons confided that they had received ominous correspondence from Sterling Creek's legal team questioning their own property boundaries, implying that historical fence lines might not align with current surveys and suggesting that legal challenges could be forthcoming. Pete Martinez had been approached by HOA representatives who suggested his small ranch might be better suited for more suitable development, offering to assist him in locating purchasers who could utilize the land for a higher and more beneficial purpose. These individuals, who had honestly labored on this land for generations, were being systematically coerced into silence by a woman who had resided in the area for less than 2 years, but somehow felt entitled to dictate what was best for our community. I realized I was not merely contending for my own ranch. I was fighting for all of us, for a way of life that individuals like Brenda Carril regarded as expendable impediments to their vision of profitable advancement. When our cease and desist notices were dispatched, delivered via certified mail with return receipts requested, Sterling Homes and the HOA did not merely disregard them, they actually expedited their work schedule, pushing deeper into my property, and erecting more poles with what appeared to be deliberate malice. It was a calculated act of defiance, a message that they did not fear my legal threats and would not be intimidated by some country lawyer's formal language. They were testing my resolve, confident that their powerful legal team could delay any court challenge sufficiently to finalize the power line and present judges with a fait accompli. Once the line was operational and supplying electricity to occupied residences, they calculated, no court would order its removal regardless of how it had arrived there. They were banking on the system's reluctance to disrupt established facts, even facts brought about through illicit activity. The initial court proceedings were a nightmare that corroborated my gravest fears regarding how the legal system treats rural landowners confronting affluent developers. Sterling Homes attorneys were adept at leveraging public sympathy, depicting me as an unreasonable obstructionist, impeding progress for dozens of innocent families who simply desired dependable electricity for their children's air conditioning and medical equipment. They produced dubious documents with convenient dates implying ongoing easement negotiations, making the entire dispute appear like a simple contractual misunderstanding that had been exaggerated by a stubborn property owner. Brenda even submitted a sworn declaration asserting she had engaged in multiple cordial discussions with me concerning the easement, describing fictitious meetings where I had supposedly expressed willingness to collaborate with the HOA before, altering my stance and making unreasonable demands. Every word was a blatant falsehood that infuriated me, but her confident presentation and professional demeanor made her seem more credible than my anger-fueled protests. The judge, clearly discomfited by the conflicting accounts and eager to avoid disrupting what appeared to be essential infrastructure, denied our plea for an immediate temporary restraining order. He cited the crucial nature of providing power to a new residential development and scheduled a preliminary injunction hearing for a month later. granting Sterling Homes precisely what they desired: more time to complete their illicit construction. While concealing behind the facade of ongoing legal process, each day of postponement meant increased damage to my pasture, greater disruption to my meticulously planned grazing rotation, and more funds depleting from my diminishing accounts for legal fees that were accumulating faster than I could track. I watched helplessly as they strung cables between the poles, creating their permanent monument to arrogance and disdain across land that had been in my family since before anyone involved in Sterling Creek had been born. The physical strain was immense. I was dedicating 14-hour days to managing disrupted cattle operations while meticulously documenting every facet of their encroachment for the eventual trial, capturing hundreds of photographs and videos, and maintaining comprehensive logs of damaged areas and diminished productivity. At night, I would collapse into bed, utterly depleted, only to lie awake, burning with indignation at the sheer injustice of it all. The pressure was adversely affecting my health, my relationships. Everything that mattered to me outside of this conflict I had never sought but could not abandon. My neighbors offered support in subtle ways, some even proposing more assertive measures involving wire cutters or strategically placed rifle shots that might incapacitate the equipment during the night. The temptation was potent, particularly during those grim hours when legal remedies seemed futile and self-help appeared to be the sole means of halting their relentless advance. However, I knew that such actions would only undermine my case and furnish them with precisely the justification they needed to portray me as a dangerous extremist rather than a property owner safeguarding his entitlements. I had to wage this battle correctly, even though the system seemed designed to favor affluent developers over individual landowners, even though every advantage appeared to be on their side, even though the stress was gradually consuming me from within. It was during this bleakest period, when frustration and helplessness were corroding me like acid, that I uncovered something that would fundamentally alter the entire dynamic of our dispute. While investigating the development's utility arrangements in a desperate search for any leverage I might have overlooked, I discovered that Sterling Creek's third phase was not connected to the main electrical grid like most residential developments. Instead, they had contracted with a small specialized provider that had installed a dedicated solar farm and substation specifically for the new subdivision. The arrangement made sense from a developer's standpoint. Connecting directly to the main grid would have necessitated costly infrastructure upgrades miles away and months of regulatory clearances, delaying their project and eroding profits. By constructing their own proprietary power source, they could manage the timeline and expenses while promoting the development as ecologically sound and energy self-sufficient. More significantly, this infrastructure was not owned by the regional utility company or even directly by Sterling Homes. It belonged to a distinct entity called Sterling Sun Solutions LLC, a shell corporation whose officers were the same executives listed for Sterling Homes Development Corporation. They had established this separate ownership structure, likely for liability reasons or to capitalize on green energy tax incentives, and it owned the singular source supplying that power line across my property. An audacious concept began to crystallize in my thoughts, so daring and intricate that I initially dismissed it as mere fantasy. However, the more I contemplated it, the more plausible it appeared. What if this asset, this pivotal component of Sterling Creek's infrastructure, could somehow be obtained? What if I could gain command of their very power source, leveraging their own system against them? I enlisted the assistance of specialists who could properly investigate this prospect. Maria Gonzalez was a forensic accountant I knew who typically handled corporate fraud cases, but possessed an uncanny aptitude for dissecting shell corporations and identifying financial weaknesses that others overlooked. Tom Bradley was an old university acquaintance who now worked in commercial real estate brokerage, specifically dealing with distinct commercial properties and industrial assets that most brokers would avoid. What they uncovered over the subsequent weeks was absolutely magnificent in its implications. Sterling Sun Solutions LC was encountering financial difficulties in ways that Sterling Homes had likely not fully comprehended when they established it. The construction expenses for the solar farm had significantly exceeded the budget due to site preparation issues and equipment delays. The power purchase agreement between the LLC and the Sterling Creek HOA, likely negotiated by Sterling Homes executives wearing both hats, was not generating sufficient revenue to comfortably service the debt they had incurred to construct the facility. Maria found indicators that the LLC was barely breaking even, possibly even operating slightly at a loss each month. The parent company was not directly guaranteeing the debt, meaning Sterling Sun Solutions was financially isolated and susceptible. Meanwhile, Tom's discreet inquiries through his network revealed that Sterling Homes was seeking to free up capital for a much grander development project across the state, and their chief financial officer had been quietly exploring the sale of what they considered non-core assets. To them, Sterling Sun Solutions probably appeared to be exactly what it was: a small, single-purpose solar facility that represented underperforming capital tied up in debt servicing and operational burdens. They likely viewed it as a necessary evil that had fulfilled its objective of rapidly powering Phase 3, but now represented stagnant funds that could be more effectively deployed elsewhere. The circumstances were aligning for an acquisition that could grant me the ultimate leverage in this struggle. If I could outright purchase Sterling Sun Solutions, LLC, I would not merely control their power source. I would control their entire electrical future, holding the switch that could plunge their luxury development into darkness whenever their conduct warranted it. Working through an anonymous Delaware LLC we established named Apex Infrastructure Holdings, Tom approached Sterling Homes' CFO with what appeared to be an unsolicited offer from an external investment firm to acquire Sterling Sun Solutions outright. The approach was meticulously crafted to seem routine, just another corporate transaction that would aid Sterling Homes in optimizing their portfolio while providing the buyer with a turnkey renewable energy asset. To our astonishment and satisfaction, they accepted immediately. The CFO's office responded within days, clearly perceiving this as an opportunity to divest what they considered a cumbersome liability while generating swift cash for their next major project. They viewed Sterling Sun Solutions as a minor subsidiary that had served its purpose, not as the crucial infrastructure that sustained their flagship development. The negotiation progressed rapidly once they demonstrated interest. They were keen on a clean, swift transaction that would remove this asset from their balance sheets without complications. We structured the proposal as an all-cash transaction with minimal conditions and an expedited closing time frame, precisely what appeals to executives aiming to liberate capital quickly. Within 2 weeks of initial contact, we had reached an accord on terms that encompassed Sterling Sun Solutions' outstanding liabilities, plus a modest premium that rendered the deal appealing to Sterling Homes' profitability. They perceived it as astute asset management, transforming an underperforming subsidiary into immediate cash while eliminating ongoing operational obligations. The closing transpired seamlessly through escrow, with all documents signed electronically and funds transferred digitally. Suddenly, discreetly and entirely unbeknownst to Brenda Carril, the Sterling Creek HOA board, or any of the residents of Phase 3, I possessed the sole source of their electricity through my anonymously controlled entity. The irony was so impeccable it almost felt like divine intervention. The power line they had unlawfully constructed across my ranch, the genesis of months of legal conflicts and financial duress, was now delivering electricity generated by my own asset. They had encroached upon my property to appropriate my power, and now I literally owned their power. However, owning Sterling Sun Solutions was merely the initial step. Now came the conclusive, devastating phase of my campaign, leveraging this position to compel resolution of the original trespass while imparting a lesson they would never forget about the repercussions of harassing rural landowners. Ben Carter meticulously examined the legal ramifications. The power purchase agreement between Sterling Sun Solutions, now under my ownership, and the Sterling Creek Phase 3 HOA was the pivotal document that would dictate how I could exercise my newfound authority. Like most utility contracts, it contained detailed clauses regarding service standards, payment conditions, and, crucially, termination provisions that could be invoked under specific circumstances. We meticulously reviewed every line of that contract, searching for advantageous points and legal justifications for my impending actions. The agreement stipulated that the HOA was obligated to procure electricity exclusively from Sterling Sun Solutions as long as the facility remained operational, while Sterling Sun Solutions was obligated to provide power according to specific technical criteria and regulatory mandates. Crucially, the contract contained stipulations allowing the provider to suspend service for various reasons, including safety concerns, regulatory compliance issues, or situations where the delivery infrastructure was compromised or unlawfully situated. There were also clauses concerning maintenance, upgrades, and operational necessity that could warrant temporary shutdowns with appropriate notification. But I was not planning to rely solely on contractual loopholes. The HOA and developer's initial transgression was the illegal encroachment and construction on my ranch property. This power line, the essential conduit for the electricity I now controlled, was unlawfully positioned, and its very existence constituted an ongoing violation of my property rights. The infrastructure they depended on was fundamentally compromised by its illicit foundation. This was not merely about breach of contract. It was about utilizing my newly acquired position to address the underlying illegality that had initiated this entire conflict. I possessed both the legal entitlement and the practical capability to demand a resolution. Ben drafted a formal notification from Apex Infrastructure Holdings, LLC, to the Sterling Creek HOA, clarifying that recent changes in ownership had revealed serious apprehensions regarding the legal standing of crucial transmission infrastructure. The document detailed how the power line, poles, and cables traversing private ranch land owned by David Davies constituted ongoing encroachment that had been validated through property surveys and was the subject of pending legal action. The correspondence invoked clauses pertaining to operational safety, legal adherence, and the provider's obligation to safeguard its assets and ensure service legality. It informed the HOA that effective 48 hours from receipt of the notice, Sterling Sun Solutions LLC would be compelled to temporarily cease power transmission through the compromised infrastructure awaiting resolution of the trespass issue. This suspension was presented as essential to mitigate legal risks associated with operating unlawfully situated infrastructure and to conduct a comprehensive safety evaluation of the transmission system. The letter courteously suggested that the HOA contact Sterling Homes Development Corporation, the entity responsible for the initial illicit installation, to arrange for the immediate removal of the offending power line from Mr. Davies's property. We synchronized the delivery with calculated precision. Late Thursday afternoon of what was projected to be the warmest weekend of the summer, with temperatures expected to surge well above 40 degrees Celsius and persist there through Monday. The notice was personally delivered by a bonded courier to guarantee receipt, while duplicates were simultaneously emailed to every HOA board member and Sterling Homes executive we could identify. I envisioned Brenda Carril receiving that notice in her air-conditioned HOA office, perhaps initially bewildered by the unfamiliar Apex Infrastructure Holdings letterhead, then startled by the announcement of ownership transfer, and finally horrified as she realized their power was being disconnected in 2 days due to the very power line they had unlawfully constructed across my ranch. The 48-hour warning was legally defensible, framed as an operational necessity resulting from the illegally sited infrastructure discovered by new management. It also afforded them just enough time to panic and scramble for remedies, but insufficient time to arrange alternative power sources or obtain emergency injunctions, especially over a weekend when courts and government offices would be closed. Their provisional solution, the one they had considered so astute and economical, was now entirely within my dominion. Connecting to the main electrical grid, as I was aware from my research, was an intricate procedure demanding months of planning, regulatory consents, and infrastructure construction. They had specifically established Sterling Sun Solutions to circumvent that protracted process, and now their shortcut had become their susceptibility. The telephone commenced ringing Thursday evening, starting with Brenda Carril herself. Her voice was no longer composed and controlled, but shrill with panic and disbelief. She demanded to know the identity of this Apex Holdings company, how I could possibly own their power source, asserting it was outrageous and unlawful to jeopardize their electricity supply. I calmly explained that Apex Infrastructure Holdings was indeed the new proprietor of Sterling Sun Solutions LLC, their contracted power provider, having acquired the company through normal commercial channels. Due to the illegal trespass situation that her HOA and developer had created by running transmission infrastructure across my property, Apex was legally obligated to suspend operations through unlawfully sited equipment for safety and legal compliance reasons. When she stammered about residents and families, about individuals with medical conditions who required air conditioning, about the liability I would face if someone was harmed, I calmly reminded her that all accountability originated from their decision to trespass and construct unauthorized infrastructure on my property. This was a fact she had been repeatedly cautioned about and had chosen to disregard while dismissing my concerns and treating my property rights as inconsequential. I suggested she direct her grievances to Sterling Homes Development and demand the immediate removal of their unlawful installation. Once the trespass was rectified and legally compliant transmission infrastructure was in place, Apex would gladly discuss resuming service under appropriate conditions. Friday ushered in a deluge of increasingly desperate calls from Sterling Homes' legal department. Their demeanor shifted dramatically from their customary arrogant dismissal to barely concealed panic as they grasped the extent of their vulnerability. They threatened litigation, injunctions, emergency court mandates, anything they could conceive to compel power restoration before the weekend shutdown. Ben handled them with calm professionalism, emphasizing that Apex Infrastructure Holdings was operating entirely within its rights as the legal owner of Sterling Sun Solutions, responding to pre-existing illicit conditions created by their client. Any attempt to compel Apex to transmit power through unlawfully situated infrastructure would fail because courts typically do not order private entities to participate in ongoing criminal trespass. We were prepared for legal challenges, but the strength of our position lay in their original wrongdoing. They had instigated this predicament through their arrogance and illegal conduct, and now they were ensnared by the repercussions of their own actions. Saturday morning dawned bright and scorching, with temperatures already soaring past 32 degrees Celsius by 9 o'clock and heading for a brutal peak above 40 degrees. At precisely 10 o'clock, as stipulated in our 48-hour notice, technicians employed by Apex Infrastructure Holdings executed the shutdown procedure at the Sterling Sun Solutions substation. The actual process was not dramatic, merely the systematic toggling of main circuit breakers, the gradual cessation of transformer hums, the quiet deactivation of systems that had been operating continuously since the facility became active. But the effect rippling through Sterling Creek Phase 3 would be profound and immediate. I drove to a small elevation on my ranch that overlooked the Sterling Creek development, desiring to witness this moment that represented the culmination of months of legal battles, financial strain, and emotional exhaustion. As the morning progressed and the sun ascended higher, the silence pervading those expensive homes became almost palpable. No air conditioning units humming on their pads, no pool pumps circulating water, no refrigerators running, no ceiling fans rotating. Just stillness and the rapidly encroaching, oppressive weight of Texas summer heat bearing down on houses that had been designed for comfort and opulence, but were now transforming into costly ovens baking under the relentless sun. Those large, lavish residences with their impeccable landscaping and three-car garages suddenly appeared less impressive and more like monuments to the arrogance that had led their owners to this juncture. The visual was incredibly gratifying, not merely out of spite, but from a profound sense of long-awaited justice finally being served. The immediate aftermath was precisely the pandemonium I had anticipated. Within the first hour after the shutdown, Sterling Creek's social media groups were erupting with frantic messages from residents discovering that their power was completely cut. Air conditioners had sputtered to silence, leaving houses to rapidly heat up in the brutal sun. Ceiling fans glided to a halt, eliminating even the illusion of air circulation. Pool equipment ceased functioning, leaving swimming pools to stagnate in the heat. Individuals who had paid premium prices for guaranteed luxury and comfort, who had been assured by Brenda that any power issues were minor inconveniences being managed by competent professionals, suddenly found themselves confined in rapidly heating. Residences with no available respite and no clear timeline for restoration. My phone, which I had judiciously configured to screen unknown calls, illuminated like a festive tree with dozens of voicemails accumulating throughout the day. The messages ranged from bewildered inquiries from residents who had somehow obtained my number, to enraged accusations and outright menaces from people who blamed me for their distress without comprehending how their own HOA's unlawful actions had created the predicament. Brenda Carril called incessantly, her voicemails cycling through every emotional phase from frantic demands to tearful pleas, then back to furious threats. She left messages asserting I was jeopardizing children and elderly residents, that I would face substantial lawsuits if anyone was harmed, that influential individuals in the community would ensure I paid for this outrage. Sterling Homes' legal team attempted a completely different approach, abandoning their previous arrogance in favor of increasingly desperate settlement proposals. They emailed proposed agreements throughout the weekend, each more magnanimous than the last, pledging to eventually remove the power line, pay significant damages, cover all my legal expenses, anything to immediately restore electricity before. Their public relations catastrophe worsened. Ben responded to each offer with professional courtesy but unwavering resolve. The power situation was now governed by Apex Infrastructure Holdings, LLC, and Sterling Sun Solutions, LLC, addressing serious operational and legal issues stemming from unlawfully placed transmission infrastructure. Any discussion about power restoration was contingent upon the complete and immediate removal of all trespassing equipment from my property. No removal, no power. Full stop. The weekend dragged on under blistering temperatures that peaked near 42 degrees Celsius on Sunday, making it one of the hottest weekends of the year. Reports filtered back to me through various channels about the conditions in Sterling Creek. Residents were congregating outside their homes, desperately fanning themselves and sharing battery-powered fans among families with children. Kids were splashing in swimming pools that were rapidly turning lukewarm without functional filtration systems. Some families checked into hotels if they could locate available rooms during the peak summer season, but many others, perhaps less financially flexible or unable to abandon their homes and possessions, were simply stuck, enduring the heat that their HOA president's hubris had inflicted upon them. By Sunday evening, I heard arguments were erupting at emergency HOA meetings. Irate residents were apparently directly blaming Brenda Carril, as she had assured them the easement dispute would not affect their power. Local news outlets picked up the story, initially a mysterious outage, but details of the property dispute and bizarre power source acquisition quickly surfaced. A Houston TV reporter contacted me. I provided a concise, cautious statement concentrating on the encroachment and my disregarded attempts at peaceful resolution. I elucidated that an unauthorized high-voltage power line had been unlawfully constructed across my ranch by Sterling Homes and the HOA. Despite months of warnings, I continued, the entity now responsible for their electricity, Apex, though I withheld my company's name, deemed this illegal placement an unacceptable hazard, so service was suspended pending the removal of the trespassing infrastructure. I emphasized that this was solely due to the developer and HOA disregarding property rights and building illicitly. I refrained from mentioning my ownership of Apex, allowing the emphasis to remain on property rights. I observed Brenda Carril and Sterling Homes fumbling with damage control. I heard Brenda's tactless news interview, still blaming an unreasonable landowner and complications, infuriating residents. Sterling Homes issued bland communiques, but their options were limited. They could not compel Apex to operate illegal infrastructure. An emergency grid connection was too protracted and expensive. Repurchasing Sterling Sun Solutions, now mine, was out of the question. They were ensnared. By Monday morning, pressure was intense. Incensed residents reportedly inundated the county commissioner's office and confronted the developer. Sterling Homes stock experienced a downturn. Late Monday afternoon, Ben informed me that Sterling Homes' lawyer had called, utterly defeated, inquiring what it would take to resolve the crisis, acknowledging their client's errors. Ben articulated our unchanged stipulations: immediate removal of all their power line equipment from my property, full restoration of my damaged pasture, supervised by my consultant at their expense, dismissal of their counterclaims, and no future. Legal action from them, payment of substantial damages, full reimbursement of my legal fees, and formal written apologies from Sterling Homes and the HOA. Only after all this, Ben stated, would Apex discuss restoring power under a new, more stringent agreement necessitating legal infrastructure, not on my land, and significant penalties for future infractions. After a prolonged silence, Ben said, their lawyer simply instructed him to dispatch the settlement, and they would endorse it by the following day. The swiftness of their capitulation was astonishing. Within hours, a different team of contractors specialists in deconstruction and infrastructure removal arrived at the perimeter of my property, setting up equipment and awaiting dawn to commence the laborious process of dismantling the power line. they had so arrogantly erected just months prior. Witnessing those crews arrive was almost as gratifying as watching the poles come down. These were not the same conceited contractors who had disregarded my property rights and scoffed at my objections. These were professionals hired specifically to undo the damage, operating under strict oversight and facing penalties if they caused any additional harm to my land. Tuesday morning, under the scorching sun, they began removing the illegal equipment. Within 3 days, all poles and cables were gone from my pasture, though the land remained scarred. I observed closely. Sterling Homes signed the settlement, promptly wiring funds for damages and legal fees, and engaged my consultant to restore the land. They also dispatched formal written apologies, admitting their illegal trespass and violation of my rights. Only after the trespass lawsuit was settled and all equipment removed did I, as owner of Apex Infrastructure Holdings, permit Ben to negotiate the power supply. Sterling Homes, desperate due to the enraged HOA, found no alternative to my offer. Generators were too costly, and connecting to the main grid would take 6-8 months, leaving residents without power in the oppressive Texas summer. The new power agreement from Apex was substantially more expensive and stricter than before, reflecting market rates and the risks their illicit actions had created. It included considerable penalties for future issues and Apex's right to immediately cut power for violations. There was also a substantial reconnection fee. They complained about the price, but Ben stated those were the only terms, given their past conduct. Facing additional power disruptions and legal actions from residents, the HOA conceded. The agreement was finalized, fees disbursed. Only then did I permit Sterling Sun Solutions technicians to safely reinstate power. Approximately a week following the outage, air conditioners finally functioned, providing respite from the 43°C heat. An HOA audit uncovered Brenda Carrill's misappropriation of funds and harassment. She was indicted on charges of perjury, embezzlement, and fraud. Irrefutable evidence resulted in a 3-year correctional facility sentence and restitution. Sterling Homes Development Corporation also disintegrated. Executives were found guilty. The company was penalized and declared insolvency. Our legal battle spurred the Property Rights Protection Act, fortifying regulations for developers. The Sterling Creek HOA underwent a leadership change, expressed remorse, and restored amicable neighborly relationships. I benefited from their electricity until they, at considerable expense, connected to the primary grid and acquired my contract. I then divested the energy assets advantageously. The ranch remained unblemished, my heritage preserved.